Hey everybody, hope you guys are doing well. I'm a pizza face from Italy, as you can see today. Look at, look at, let's see. Oops, wait, no. Look at, I'm holding up the Leaning Tower of Pizza. That's what everybody does when they go there. They take pictures like that. Anyway, hope you're doing well, hanging in there. Weather's been nice, so that's good, right? Yeah. And hopefully we're going to be out of this surge of recent COVID fairly soon. Everyone's got to be real careful now, but in not too long we'll hopefully have a vaccine, and maybe by spring quarter I'll be seeing you folks on campus again. Knock on wood. Oh boy, I hope, I hope, I hope. If not, maybe this summer. But we're keeping our fingers crossed. Anyway, can I see my eyes? Look at it. I look like I see my mouth. I can't tell if those are my, oh yeah, I see them now. My eyes are like olives in the pizza pie, so. All right, well, as you know, we do have an exam coming up. And so let's go ahead and talk about that. I can't remember if we have class next Tuesday. I will look into that. If we do, I will teach it. But the information that will be on the exam will be just including through today's class and next class. Let me go ahead and share that with you. Okay, there you are. Information. I'll stay at pizza while I'm doing this, I think, too. So you did receive this information, hopefully through an email. I posted it earlier today, this afternoon. What we're going to do, and this, I'm sorry about this. I know this is Thanksgiving week, but that's why I'm giving you the extra long time. It is going to be an exam that you can take during any 80-minute period between Tuesday at 12 a.m. and Monday at midnight. So the 24th through the 30th. So you could take the exam before you leave for Thanksgiving or after you come back for Thanksgiving, or if you get bored during Thanksgiving, whatever works best for you folks. I know everyone's Thanksgiving plans are so messed up this year anyway. But hopefully with that much time, you'll find some convenient time to study. Now, the exam will cover everything from the last exam, since the last exam, I should mention, through Thursday's lecture. And I will let you know the more detailed information on what will be covered on Thursday, obviously on Thursday, but then how that pertains to the book chapters. I'm hopefully going to come close to finishing Touch today. And then if I don't finish today, I'll certainly finish it on Thursday, and then I'll be able to start on some face perception stuff. But it will not be the entire face perception topic that I'll be able to get through. So that's why the book chapters are 5 and 6. 5 is taste, 6 and 7 are touch. 8 is face perception, but it's just probably going to be the first parts of that chapter. And I will certainly let you know more details as we come upon it. So what's going to be on this next midterm is going to be what I'm presenting through Thursday's lecture. Okay. And again, I will let you know the book chapter parts of chapter 8 that are going to be relevant to those lectures. You're done with your discussion section stuff for the test. So your coming discussion sections, there will be a discussion section on Friday and one on Monday. Those will be review sessions to help you review. And I guess the TAs are probably going to handle it the same way they did last time. So I guess it'll be part kind of quiz, a game sort of thing. And then you can have a chance certainly to ask questions. What else? I think that pretty much covers everything I have on the slides. So I will find out if we do have class on Tuesday, a week from today. If we do, okay, I will be presenting new material during that lecture, probably also on face perception, but new material for face perception that will be covered on the last exam, the last of our 3 exams. Okay, let me go ahead and take some questions. I am going to actually de-pizzafy myself here so I can answer your questions more seriously. There I am. Okay. So let's go ahead and see if people have questions. Looks like there's a few. Roya says, Doctor, you're a piece of work. Okay, thank you. That was a good one. I might use that, in fact, to teach it again like this. Will there be the same questions from the first exam on this exam? No, these will be all new questions. There will be no repetition from the first exam. It'll be all new questions on this exam, but many of which you'll know because of your exposure to these questions during the polling questions we're doing in class. Okay, Ray. Well, the number of questions would be about the same. Yeah, it's going to depend to some degree on how far I can get through the face perception material on Thursday, but estimate somewhere between, say, 45 and at the most 55 questions. I'll be lucky if I get that far. Okay, I certainly will have a quick chance to talk about this at the beginning of next class as well, but are there any other questions about the exam or how we're going to work this class and next next class, and then Tuesday's class? Does anybody know offhand if we have classes on Tuesday? I'm pretty sure we have classes on Monday. I know the discussion sections will be run on Monday. I can't remember if we have classes on Tuesday. Maybe you folks can, if you find that out during lecture, let me know. It really won't make a difference for your next exam. It will just be material that will be presented on the last exam anyway, but I certainly will lecture and it will be recorded and all that stuff. So I can't afford to cut out lectures, that's for certain. I'm certain everyone during this Zoom period is going slower, sadly, than we usually do. So I want to make sure I can get as much in as possible. You guys pay good money for this, so you should get your money's worth. Okay, any other questions about the exam coming up or anything like that at this point? Then let me go ahead and we will continue our discussion of touch. Oh, there's one more. Yeah, we have classes until Thursday. So there's no class. Do we have classes Wednesday too, Alexa? Yeah, just out of curiosity. Yeah, we have classes until Thursday, I think, because that's when the break starts. Okay, so I will teach on Tuesday. It will be material that will be covered on the last exam, though not that will be covered on the exam that actually will start on Tuesday. So that makes perfect sense for you. Okay, thank you for that. And now I'll make sure that that's very clear next time we meet. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue talking. And remember, we actually just covered, in a sense, the most technically, I guess, I don't know, complicated slide, but hopefully you didn't think it was that complicated because I tried to teach it in a fairly intuitive manner using the example of me destroying my wall with my housemates back in graduate school. And I'm just gonna, just go through this. You already have all this information down. In fact, what I'll do is I'll just show the whole slide. I've got to go through it line by line as I do this again, but you get the idea is just this is a slide you've already seen. The big picture here is the idea that short-term plasticity that occurs through some early practice has to be sustained, and when it is sustained, it gives rise to long-term plasticity. And so the behaviors, the learning actually becomes part of our repertoire. They become kind of second nature. And we talked a little bit about what happens neurologically as that occurs when at first for short-term plasticity, when you're first learning a new skill, neural connections that are kind of there but dormant, don't actually carry information between neurons, kind of gets reestablished. So the idea of once dormant connections are reestablished during short-term plasticity. However, if we kind of give up on learning, say you're trying to learn a new skill, dart throwing, and you say, this just isn't for me. And after a few days of dart throwing, you might get better over the few days, but then you decide to put it away. Then those dormant connections after a while will kind of close up again. However, if dart throwing is your thing, you say, this is great. I want to do a semester in London, so I better learn how to do this well. Then you keep practicing. And practicing not only kind of maintains these connections that were once dormant, but gives rise to new connections. New connections are formed. And once these are formed, that's when you kind of move into long-term plasticity, and you'll be a good, if not a very good dart player, for much of your life, even if you haven't practiced for very long. But it does take sustained practice. And we talked about an example with that, playing a pattern on a keyboard, a piano or electronic keyboard, like you're seeing there. This allowed the researchers a way to kind of track the brain as people learn the keyboard pattern. What they found is, at first, when people were learning the keyboard pattern, when they looked at their brain before each practice session, they found that it was kind of, what it was like in the very beginning before any practice occurred. But then after 2 hours of practice, they did start seeing shifts in the brain, showing that practice. But then they came back the next day, and the brain had reverted. But then 2 hours of practice, oh yeah, there it is again, terrific. So then they send half of the group home, and they practice for 4 weeks in the same manner. And when they come back, even before they go ahead and do their little performance or their 2-hour practice session, their brains had already kind of shown the change that had been shown after the practice earlier. In other words, the practice had changed, the long-term practice had allowed the brain to change so that it was set up to perform correctly. And that's, kind of practice makes perfect, or practice makes expertise. This is exactly what the kind of neurophysiology behind that is. Now these changes have been established, and you don't need to really practice in order to establish it that way. So the brain is reorganized before the practice session. The brain has actually been sustained. Okay, great. That's what we've been through. Now I just want to say with a little bit more about this experiment, because I think you're going to find this part very interesting. I lied to you about the entire experiment. I mean, the entire experiment is true, but I lied saying that was the entire experiment, because there was one more subject group that was tested. And that one more subject group did something very interesting. They did spend a few minutes initially learning how to play the keyboard pattern on the keyboard. But then, I think maybe after half an hour, maybe an hour, they put it away and were told to mentally practice. I think they actually had the keyboard sitting there in the desk in front of them. But rather than touching the keyboard and moving their fingers, they just held their hands steady and looked at the keyboard and mentally practiced. And some very interesting things happened with them. Okay, they only touch the keyboard in the very beginning for the very first day, and then they go through this kind of, whatever it is, 5-day, 2-hour practice sessions. But they don't touch the keyboard, they don't move their fingers, they just think about it in their mind. They think about what it would look like to move their fingers on the keyboard in the specific pattern they had learned. And so what we're talking about here is kind of a neuroplasticity that's going to be kind of induced by kind of concentrating on something rather than actually performing it, because that's exactly what happens. Folks that mentally practice this keyboard pattern for 4 days, in fact, improve their performance and showed not quite as dramatic shifts in their brain, but still shifts in their brain. But they do improve their performance over subjects that just come in and don't practice at all. So you may have heard this before, that if you're an athlete, if you're a performing a musician or something, that it does pay to kind of go through a mental imagery of you performing those skills. And we know a little bit about the most effective way of doing it. It's more effective if you imagine yourself from your perspective, like playing a keyboard, right? Rather than say, the other way you might be able to do this, it's harder, I think, for me, but you can imagine yourself seeing yourself from the side playing the keyboard, right? You can imagine yourself both from the perspective of where you would sit if you were playing, or where an audience would sit watching you play. And there's no question, mental performance, mental practice, mental imagery practice is best if you are practicing from your own perspective. And it actually, improves performance and does some of this shifting of the motor brain areas that we discussed before, which is really, really interesting, I think. It's not as much of a shifting of the reorganization of the motor brain as if you're actually, doing the performance, practicing, and it is not sustained. I don't think this has ever been tested over the course of having people then go home for 4 weeks and test. That was not part of this experiment, at least. But It's more subtle, but it still works. It is an effective way to practice if you don't have your keyboard in front of you, if you don't have the athletic gear you need to practice basketball or something. Athletes will say they mentally practice on the bus on the way to the game, even though they don't have access to the ball and the hoop right in front of them. And it does seem to make some bit of a difference, which is really interesting. I guess this is the same plasticity as the physical practice. I don't know if it's quite as much, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. For our purpose, we'll say the plasticity does occur. So it does occur, and performance also improves from the mental practice of these keyboard patterns rather than the physical practice of these keyboard patterns. So it's really, really interesting. What else? Well, if you look on the slide there, you'll see there's a person performing an exercise. It's kind of a martial arts exercise, kind of a cross between martial arts and yoga almost. It's called Tai Chi. And maybe some of you practice Tai Chi. It's often something that's done with older folks because it really helps with balance and it helps with kind of controlling the body. You see when they have like advertisements for medication for older folks or something like that, very often they'll show, a group of older folks doing, these motions out in a park somewhere. That's Tai Chi. And I don't know the details of it. My parents actually did it for a while as they were getting older. They loved it. But there's some interesting research that's been done with folks that do Tai Chi for a long period of time. So this is part of Tai Chi. I didn't know. You're moving your arms around and kind of rebalancing yourself, changing your center of gravity. But you're letting you kind of what happens, I guess, to some degree at least, what your hands are doing. And maybe you Tai Chi, folks can help me with this a little bit. But I guess one thing they do is they say to keep your fingers very still and imagine as you're moving around almost as if there's like light beams leaving your fingers that you're I guess maybe almost painting the surrounding environment with, the tips of your fingers. If the tips of your fingers could extend out, or there were light beams extending out of your fingers, those lights would very slowly and smoothly move over the environment around you. And I guess for the most part, your fingers never really touch anything, but you do concentrate very strongly on your fingers as you're performing this. Okay. Again, I don't know very much about Tai. I've never tried it myself, but that's what I've been told. And some really interesting things happen with these folks that have been doing it for a while. They actually show, so it involves intense concentration on the fingertips. And what they show is actually, without making any contact at all, that's not a part of this exercise at all. They show enhanced touch sensitivity in their fingertips. Okay, more so than maybe another part of their hand, because they are told to concentrate very, very intensely on what their fingertips are doing. Keep your fingers as straight as possible. Imagine them kind of, if they could stretch out, they would be kind of gliding across the, trees and grass that are around you as you're exercising. And thinking about that intensely for, say, an hour every other day or something like that is enough to actually enhance their sense of touch. And I think the way sense of touch was measured here was this thing that we've talked about before, where you either place a grid that goes horizontally across the fingertip or vertically across the fingertip. And the job of the subjects is to say whether it's horizontal or vertical. And the question is how much pressure needs to be applied. It's very light pressure, but how much pressure needs to be applied until people can make that distinction. And it turns out that if you practice Tai Chi like this, that having that intense concentration on your fingers allows you to be more sensitive to that distinction between the vertical and horizontal lines, which is really interesting. Okay, just let me know if you're hearing me okay. I'm not seeing any comments. I just want to make sure that everything's working okay. So maybe you're a little quiet. Just, yep, good, fine. Nope, just that you don't have to do any more. Just want to make sure that everyone's hearing me. Good. All right, yep, all right. So there's one other thing. So since we're talking now about concentration, there's something I think you'll find very interesting in this final demonstration, which is a kind of cool experiment. Um, this is an experiment where people went into the laboratory and they put their fingers on this kind of interesting device that had holes in it. I think 4 holes. Okay, and they were just big enough, these holes. Do I have anything here like that? Yeah, imagine it's like your cell phone or something like that. So it's, you know, it's a little panel about the, is the cell phone showing here? Oh, that's right. Everything's backwards now. Sorry. So they have their fingers on the cell phone like this. Not a cell phone, it's a little frame. And underneath the frame underneath the holes are little kind of rubber brushes that brush up against the skin. And it's kind of a very intricate sort of device that exists underneath those holes, because what can happen is the brushes, these little rubber brushes, can kind of swipe across the fingers in different patterns. Okay, so here's my fingers on the little frame and on the holes, and here are these little, pretend my right hand is these little rubber brushes. They're going to come and maybe, you know, get the middle finger first, and then the index finger, and then the ring finger, and then the pinky, maybe just in that order. Okay, and the orders can change too. All right. The other thing that can happen is it doesn't need to be the case that they're all going in one direction. Sometimes they can go like that. Sometimes they can go like this. Okay, so that's 2 different, you know, factors that can be changed here. You know, which finger is touched first out of the ones that are, you know, touching this little frame device, and then are those little rubber brushes underneath going, you know, in the direction, this direction, towards the finger or away from the finger. And you can have subjects, you know, kind of given the task to do one of those 2 different sorts of judgments. Okay, concentrate on all your fingers, and it doesn't matter how they're touched. It doesn't matter if the brushes go this way or that way or whatever. Just tell us the order that your fingers were touched in. So here we go: middle finger, ring finger, index finger, ring finger. And they just have to report that back. Okay, my fingers were touched in this order, right? And then they go through like an hour of just doing that, right? Another group of subjects would get the exact same little rubber brush stimulation, but they would just concentrate on one finger. And on that, say, index finger, they'd have to determine the ordering of how they were brushed. Okay, so at first maybe they got this type of brush, then that type of brush, and then that type of brush again, going away from the hand, then 2 more coming towards the hand. And they'd have to report after, say, 10 touches, what that stimulation was like. Again, both groups of subjects are getting the exact same touches from all these little brushes. One group is concentrating on all the fingers as they are touched, and the other group is just concentrating on a single finger. And even though the stimulation is the same, what the mind concentrates on, what the brain is attending towards, will determine how the touch brain area shifts around. Okay, so with attention just to a single finger's touch, what you find is that the area, remember our touch cortex here is called the sensory cortex right here. The touch area, there it is right there, will expand for that finger. If on the other hand, you're in the group that is attending to all 4 fingers and has to report, what the stimulation is across the fingers, then you won't see it disproportionately grow for any single finger. It might grow a tiny bit for all 4 fingers, where if you're just concentrating on a single finger, it will grow for that finger just for a time being. And the important thing here is both groups get the exact same touch stimulation through this little frame thing. Their fingers are being touched in exactly the same way. But whether you're concentrating on what's going on with one finger or all 4 fingers, your brain will shift. So it really speaks to the importance of what one is attending to when it comes to neuroplasticity, right? Neuroplasticity can happen in a number of ways, but one of the most interesting ways, I think, is it can depend on what one is thinking of. And if you remember the rubber hand illusion, remember you went through that in discussion section, that little crazy video of me maybe you saw. It kind of makes sense because what's going on there when you're looking at the rubber hand, the one that's ultimately going to be hit with the hammer, that you start to feel is your own, it is true that the brain kind of makes room for it. Even though the rubber hand itself hasn't been touched, right? It's your other hand that's been touched. And, if the hand is bigger, if it's just a single finger that's there, I mean, there's so many ways of manipulating that rubber hand illusion to show that, what you see and concentrate on, what you attend to, can influence how neuroplasticity in the brain occurs beyond just how you're touched, for example, or beyond the motor skill you're learning. What you think about, in other words, when I'm talking about thinking, I'm talking about attending, what you're concentrating on, will also influence how the brain shifts around when it comes to touch perception, which is really interesting. And it's nice because it brings us to the next topic, which has to do with amputees. And you may have heard about this sort of, oops, hold on just a second. This happened last class too. Okay. My little screensaver goes on if I put the cursor in the corner, and that's what happened. Hopefully we're still working. It seemed to work fine last time. And so if you've read ahead, you know that I did have a chance to interview an amputee who had just recently had this amputation. I can't remember if it was 2 weeks or so when I talked to him. He was still in the hospital. His name's Ben Curry. And because of fairly severe diabetes, he had a blood flow problem to one of his feet, and didn't realize that he had a pretty severe infection in that foot, and it got real bad, and so they actually had to amputate his leg from the knee, from below the knee down. So yes, he had left leg amputation below the knee. And I had a friend that was a physician that was treating him. And I was talking to the friend about a lot of this touch research that was going on. And he brought up, well, he said, I deal with the amputees all the time, and this is very relevant to what they experience. And so I had a chance to talk with Ben, and it was really interesting. It was very kind of him to really kind of share his experience. And it is a very traumatic experience, as you can imagine, losing a limb. It really is something very difficult. And what Ben told me he had was something that's that sometimes does occur with amputees. That is phantom pain. And what phantom pain is a situation where he actually feels pain in a limb that is no longer there. So he says he feels pain in the toe, in fact, that had the infection that they had to remove as they removed his foot and lower leg. But he does feel pain down there. He finds himself sometimes, going down to that area where his toe should be, where it used to be, and kind of massaging that area a little bit. And it makes him feel better in kind of an odd way. Now, in the old days, we used to not really understand what was going on. And it made things, I think, a little worse for these folks. When they experienced pain down there. And sometimes they don't experience pain. Sometimes, as I'll talk about in a second, they experience like a tickling sensation. And it often is in the part of the body that was injured for whatever reason, as he feels it in the toe that had the infection. But in the old days, they used to say, well, this is probably kind of a psychosomatic sort of thing that's going on. That's a reaction to the emotional trauma of having an amputation. And it was understandable, but it kind of made these individuals kind of feel like, well, if it's psychosomatic, if it's not, it's not really anything to do with the actual amputation. It's just how I'm reacting to it. It would make them feel like, boy, now I've got to worry about my emotional life, or I'm going to have a pain like this forever. And it was a tough thing. But now we know that it has to do with plasticity, and it helps them. It helps the patients just having that information. So Ben was absolutely aware of this before he had the amputation, and certainly after the amputation, he went through like a mini video course or something like that told him what could very likely happen. And the video course taught him a little bit about neuroplasticity, and taught him that when you lose a limb, neuroplasticity can be very extreme, and one of the byproducts of that extreme neuroplasticity can be either pain in a limb that no longer is there, or just sensation in a limb that's no longer there. Okay. So he knew this, and so when I talked to him, he said, "Yeah, when I bend down to scratch or kind of rub my toe that's not there, I know what I'm doing is I'm kind of helping my brain kind of deal with this massive kind of insult that resulted in the severe neuroplasticity." He had a beautiful way of saying it. He said, I realized I'm kind of so I met him 2 weeks after the amputation. Sorry, he says I'm kind of patronizing my brain. I'm helping the touch parts of my brain kind of heal from this, because he knows that this is what happened. So he, of course, it was an emotional event for him. There's no question. He was very sad about it. You can read a little bit about that in the book if you're interested. But he knew that the pain he was feeling was not psychosomatic, really. It was something that was a result of just the kind of normal plasticity, or the plasticity reaction that occurred from the amputation. So as it turns out, not everybody has this phantom pain, but most amputees do have something called phantom sensation, and it's just basically a low-grade version of phantom pain, where it's not that the limb that's missing hurts, it's that there are kind of a tickling feeling in it. So, where Ben did have a little pain down there, another amputee with the same type of amputation might feel, I don't know, like their foot's asleep or something like that, even though their foot is no longer there. Or there's a tickling on the soles of my feet, or my toe feels a little numb. And most amputees at least have this. It says 90% there, and I believe that's still considered pretty accurate since 2010 when the book was written. And so, I wasn't aware of that. I didn't know the percentage. I thought it was kind of a once in maybe every 10 people who had amputations, or maybe every one of every 50 people who had amputations had this experience. But it is the vast majority of them that have at least some sensation in the amputated limb. So they used to think, as I said, that maybe there was some nerve damage at the stump that was there, but as I said before, it often was attributed to emotional trauma. And sometimes the way they would treat it with people who had severe pain, and that pain that was persisted over the course of years, is they would do a new surgery at the stump in order to see if they could kind of sever the nerves in different places to see if that would help, and it rarely helped. The emotional trauma, of course, they would treat by asking people to go to a therapist and talk about their emotional reactions and all that stuff, and it probably helped just generally, but it didn't really typically help with the sensation or the brain or the pain very much. Now we know it is overexuberant neuroplasticity. And I should mention, I haven't looked at this literature for about 5 years or whatever. But we do know it's related to neuroplasticity. We don't know exactly what in the neuroplasticity causes somebody to have, say, pain versus just phantom sensation. But we can see correlations. Okay, this isn't really my field, so I haven't kept completely up on it. But as of 5 years ago, we do know this sort of thing, that the more organization you see, the more likely there is going to be some type of pain or intense sensation. So, what we're talking about here is losing a leg, and say, well, this is actually labeled here. The leg on this little map here is up here. So the representation of the lower leg is here. And if it's the left leg, I guess it would be on the right side of the brain. That's fine. Don't worry about it. But then what would happen is, since the lower leg is no longer there, is that other parts of the map would kind of take over. And how extreme that takeover was from, say, the part of the map that represented the hip or the trunk. In other words, these are the parts of the brain that light up as those parts of the body are touched. the more those parts took over from where the map of the leg had been, the more likely the patient was to have pain. Also, interestingly, another way to predict the pain is the extent of the pain or the intensity of the phantom sensation has to do with what body part takes over for the part that's missing on the map of the brain. So here, let me get this down for you. The distance of the body parts themselves. So I don't know if you can see this here, but where the fingers, oh shoot, maybe you can't see this. Well, the fingers are represented right here, okay? The hand's above it, and the mouth is below it. So if people have their, say, a few fingers amputated or even maybe a single finger amputated, and what takes over is, in fact, part of the hand or part of another finger, if that part takes over the map, things are going to be okay. However, if what takes over from the finger amputation is the map of the mouth, which is further away on the body, there's going to be more likelihood that the patient is going to have pain. Okay? So they can make some predictions as they watch things. And they've incorporated that knowledge into treating this. So, maybe after somebody loses a finger or two, what they'll do is do a lot of stimulation of the remaining fingers to hopefully push that part of their body's map, okay, towards where the other fingers had been mapped in the brain. Okay. So that's one way that kind of new treatments have been doing, is to try to make sure that the shifts that occur in the brain are not overly dramatic, and that you're not allowing a part of the body, say such as the mouth relative to the hand, to take over, because those body parts are pretty separate from each other, and that seems to be related to more severe pain as well. So you do stimulate the fingers that are left over, hoping that that's what goes ahead and takes over that area on the brain. Okay, other things as well, and I guess this has some. The last I looked at it, it was still up in the air how well this works, but it is kind of like the sort of effects you guys discussed in your discussion sections when you were discussing the rubber hand illusion. If in fact you can kind of trick the brain through the visual system into thinking that the missing limb is there for at least some temporary amount of time, there are ways you can relieve some of the pain. So what's sometimes happens when people lose their hand or their arm is they have a pain, and it's not even almost like an aching or something. Instead, it kind of feels like their fist is closed and squeezing. That's not that uncommon. If someone has pain after a hand amputation, that's maybe 50% of the time that's what they'll complain about. That it's not just a kind of amorphous pain, but it's a pain that feels like the pain, the tenseness you feel when you're squeezing your hand like this. Okay. Now your hand's not there anymore, right? Your right hand's been amputated. So what they do is they put people in a box. Actually, I guess in this case, well, it looks like this guy might have both his hands, but imagine he didn't, and he was missing his right hand. What you can do is put his left hand in a mirror box, okay, and have him look at the mirror's image of that left hand. And it kind of conveys fairly, convincingly, at least visually, that it's his right hand that he's looking at. You can imagine how this would happen, right? I think, can you kind of see this here? Yeah, I don't know how this is working. Yeah, but imagine, he's looking at this side of it and he sees the reflection of his intact hand. And what that does is it kind of gives him an image of the hand that's been removed. And then what they'll have to do is sit there in the box, for maybe an hour a day and slowly release the hand that is still there. And he'll see his right hand doing the same thing, unclenching, right? And in doing so, it will relieve some of the stress that he's feeling in his amputated hand, and the pain that's in his amputated hand. Now, whether that is sustained is another question. It can certainly give temporary relief. It seems like it's fairly effective at giving temporary relief. But what they were doing last I looked is they were seeing if that would be something that had to be done periodically, if it had to be done every day. Certainly if it was stopped after maybe an hour's worth of a session, it would come back. It certainly needed more kind of consistency than that. But again, it seems that in these cases, there's ways to actually, kind of manipulate this kind of aggressive neuroplasticity that occurs with an amputation. So, it can relieve pain. It can maybe lessen how intense those phantom sensations are. And it's, I think, a good thing overall that, people like Ben Curry know that it's not, psychosomatic. This is something that we know is part of the touch brain that is absolutely kind of, making a mess of everything. Neuroplasticity we've discussed as kind of this wondrous sort of process that allows us to, kind of become experts in all the perceptual skills we've been talking about. But this is one of the instances, there's others as well, where neuroplasticity can cause problems. If it's an extreme amount of neuroplasticity, it has to be, kind of dealt with in the right way, or it can cause problems like this. Okay, that ends that part of our touch discussion. So let me see if there's any questions now, and then we'll do a practice question. Okay. Okay, Ariel asked me how long did it take me to write this book. Way too long, Ariel. It took me about a year and a half. I was given a year, but it did take longer, partly because I did a lot of interviews, and I did, I think, three times as many interviews as I actually ended up using. But that took a while to organize, but it just takes a long time to write a book. Okay, questions about phantom pain, though, and neuroplasticity? Anyone, have experience with phantom pain themselves, or know somebody who's had phantom pain experiences? Anybody? No? You're hearing me okay, right? It's just a little bit of a sleepy day, maybe? Hello? You guys hearing me? Oh my gosh.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Yes, we're sleepy, Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure. All right. Then let's do our practice question here. And this is a neuroplasticity question, not surprisingly, about short-term and long-term plasticity. So this is a question that actually involves blanks that you would be filling in. The question is this: short-term plasticity involves blank, while long-term plasticity involves blank. And then your options are forming, okay, so you can read it like this: short-term plasticity involves forming of new cell connections, while long-term plasticity involves use of dormant cell connections. That would be your answer A. Or answer B: short-term plasticity involves use of dormant cell connections, while long-term plasticity involves forming of new cell connections. Okay, answer C: short-term plasticity involves generation of new brain cells, while long-term plasticity involves loss of brain cells. Okay, or D: short-term plasticity involves loss of brain cells, while long-term plasticity involves generation of new brain cells. So I realize this is going to take a little while for you guys to read through. I'll give you a full minute to do this one, but I think you'll be able to get it right, given we just talked about it. You're doing well. Good, I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. Okay, 5 more seconds. You did well. So let me end the poll. And you, about 63% of you got this right. The correct answer is B. So that is the most frequent answer here. Fortunately, none of you put C or D. That really has very little to do with what we discussed. There are things in the book about that, but it's not in this context. But don't worry about that. So again, what happens with short-term plasticity? And the way you can remember this is to thinking about my apartment. You know, we opened the door, moved the couch out of the way, and got to use a once dormant passageway between the dining room and kitchen. Right, the door was painted shut, but we opened it and started using it. And those would be like the use of a dormant connection between rooms or a dormant connection between cells. And then after we decided that's a really good thing to have between the kitchen and dining room, we moved the couch out of the way and decided to actually knock down part of the wall so we could easily pass, dishes and food between the two rooms. And so we completely made a new connection by doing that. Right? We made like a little window, whatever it's called. I can't remember that thing called in the kitchen that goes between the kitchen and dining room, where it has a little shelf, a little counter, that space there, and it worked great. So we made new connections. So we went from kind of short-term changes to a long-term change, which is now establishing a new connection, and that's exactly what happens in the brain as we kind of play around with a new skill a little bit and decide we want to practice the skill and become good at it and take a month to really, really go at it. And then we've established these new connections. So the correct answer would be B. Use of short-term plasticity involves the use of dormant cell connections, while long-term plasticity involves forming of new cell connections. Just think about me taking that sledgehammer and knocking down the wall for long-term plasticity. Great. Okay. Let's just see if there's any other questions, and we'll move on to another topic in touch. Okay. Yes, there's one question. Kyla asks, so when parts of our body fall asleep, is that the source similar to phantom pain? Okay, no, when parts of our body fall asleep, it has to do, I'm pretty sure, with blood flow. However, the reason I said that is because that is very often what I've been told phantom sensation can be like. I've talked to other people who've had amputations, and again, 90% of them have this. It doesn't bother them that much if it's not painful, but they'll say, every once in a while I will feel a tingling in my foot, even though my foot was amputated. And that tingling, they'll say, well, it's very similar to, when your foot falls. We've all had the experience of our foot falling asleep, where you kind of feel that pins and needles. Sometimes it can be really kind of, annoying. But if you have kind of a light pins and needle experience, I think that's what the phantom sensation is like. And usually for phantom sensation, it doesn't necessarily last that long. Typically, it's more temporary, but it maybe comes once every few days or something like that. It's the folks that have intense phantom sensation or, of course, phantom pain that really need to be addressed. Again, the fortunate thing is, though, at least they know it's not some psychosomatic kind of mental, well, it is, of course, neurophysiological, but it's not something that has to do with their kind of psycho-emotional life or something like that, which takes a lot of pressure off these folks. Okay, terrific. Thank you for the question. So let's go on. Let me just do this very quickly. I'm going to switch my slide set. Oops. Yeah. Good. And we are going to talk about something that you learned about in the videos that I'm sure you all watched over the weekend. All right, hold on just a second. Let me share the screen. There we go. And that has to do with Helen Keller. So, by the way, if you haven't seen the video, you absolutely should. There will be at least one test question taken right from the video that won't be presented in any other context. So you are responsible for that. It's fun. It's half an hour long or something like that. It's an old, very, very old video. But I think it does a really nice job of giving you a sense of what this amazing woman was like. And if you read through the book, or this part of the book, certainly you know that I had experience meeting somebody who perceived speech in the exact same way as Helen Keller. So the person I'm talking about, his name is Rick Joy, and there he is. Sadly, he passed away this last year, I found out. He was in his early 70s, I believe. That's him right there. And Rick was blind and deaf from a very young age. He had started to acquire a little language. I guess he was blind very early, much earlier than before he acquired language. But then he started to acquire a little language. Then he went deaf, and I believe for him it was meningitis that led to him losing both senses. But he's an amazing guy. He was just an amazing guy. I got to spend an afternoon with him. He received a oops, what's going on here? Yeah, sorry. He received a college degree, flourished through high school, was the first deafblind Eagle Scout in Boy Scouts. And then he had a great career at Hewlett-Packard designing circuit boards for Hewlett-Packard. He was a competitive swimmer. He would set things up so he would connect some sort of not cable, I guess a rope between him and another swimmer so they could guide him in the swimming. And it was, he made the most of his life, and it was really interesting. I was a little nervous. I mean, I have to admit, I didn't know very much about him. I can't remember how I was put in touch with him, but I flew up to San Francisco. He lived outside San Francisco, and I was a little nervous, first of all, about how much we'd actually be able to communicate. And I was also a little nervous about what I would find his life to be like. We had communicated through email a little bit, and that went fine. But I don't know. I couldn't imagine what a life without sight or hearing would be like. I guess I would be nervous that it would make a life very kind of isolated, very lonely. And then I got to meet him, and he was one of the most cheerful, gregarious guys I've met. He was married. He had a 4-year-old daughter at the time. His wife was deaf but not blind. The daughter was hearing and seeing. She had no disabilities like that. And he had lots of friends. You're seeing one of his close friends there. He would do construction around his house. His neighbors all knew he was deaf and blind, but he'd be on top of the house, putting up antennas and re-shingling his house because he really loved that sort of stuff. And they'd knock on his door and tell the wife that Rick's up there doing this again. He was just very, very bright, kind of very engaged person. It was a really, really enlightening sort of interview. He was, was a radio hobbyist, and I don't know if this still exists. I think it does. It's called ham radio, and what it involves is having a shortwave radio that's very powerful in the house. And usually in fact, there was a large antenna outside Rick's house. And what it allows you to do is actually talk to folks over like a walkie-talkie type of system anywhere in the world. And it used to be really, really popular. When I was growing up, the guy next to me had one. There was a guy like 4 houses down. I mean, it was kind of a popular hobby before the internet, emerged, because this is the way you could, communicate with people all over the world, in a live context without using, snail mail and all that. And Rick learned it back then too, before the internet. And he had, talked to people he communicated with people all over the world. Well, how do you do that if you're deaf and blind? Because it's, comes through a radio. And what every radio hobbyist has to know is Morse code. And so he would, certainly send Morse code by, pushing on a little key that was attached, a little button that was attached to his system. And he would read Morse code. He couldn't hear it. He couldn't see it. He would read it by touching the loudspeaker that was connected to his amateur radio setup. So he would feel the Morse code. And if if you've ever had a large speaker that didn't have a cover on it, that it vibrates. And it vibrates enough for someone like Rick Joy to be able to interpret Morse code as the coded messages coming from people all over the world. It was really interesting. At one point, I write about this, but at one point his daughter comes bounding into the room that we're doing our interview in, and she sits next to me. I think I was sitting on a couch here, he was over here, and I did have my hand on his face, as we'll talk about in a second. But she sat on the other side of me and started talking to me, and Rick said to her, "Actually, I'm doing an interview. Can you come back in a few minutes?" She was adorable. She was very friendly. And she left, and I asked Rick, how did you know she was there? And he said, I can feel the floor. I have a sense that somebody's come into the room by feeling the vibrations of the wooden floor below my feet. And I can often tell whether it's my daughter, because the vibrations are very different, versus when it's my wife versus one of my friends. The vibrations on the floorboards feel different, and he can feel that on his feet to help determine that's not only someone's coming into the room, but that which person is coming into the room. And he also gave stories about how when he was working at Hewlett-Packard, sometimes his supervisor would come up behind him and look over his shoulder to see how he was doing. And he would always know when they did that, even though they tried to be secretive about it, because he could feel that this is a case. Hey, look, remember we talked about facial vision and breezes on the skin. This is a case where he could actually feel little changes in the breeze on the back of his neck to know when people are in the room as well. So clearly he had learned to use these really clever compensations to be able to, navigate the world and socialize with people and all that. So it was just so fun, so interesting talking to him. So how did we talk? Well, if you've gone through the Helen Keller video, you know that, but if not, I was able to understand his speech. I should mention his speech was difficult to hear for me to understand a little bit because he can't hear his own speech. He doesn't have the feedback of hearing his own speech. So it was a little hard for me to understand sometimes what he was saying. And in fact, it was harder for me to understand what he was saying than for him to understand what I was saying by him touching my face, which is what he did during the 2-hour interview. He put his hand, just like you're seeing him put his hand on his friend's face there, so that you can't see his index finger, but it's going around the side of the face here. The thumb is underneath the bottom lip, and he's got these 3 fingers touching the Adam's apple, which is really where the voice box is. And he feels that this is enough for him to be able to determine what people were saying. He was actually taught a different way. He started rehabilitation. Performs home repair, fine. He started rehabilitation when he was 11. And what they used to teach in this technique was for the thumb to go over the lips like this, and then the 3 fingers to touch the Adam's apple like this. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing over here, right? That's the way he was taught. But he said that, over time, he just felt people were more comfortable if he wasn't putting his thumbs over the lips. It was less hygienic to do that. And he felt he was getting enough lip information just by touching kind of the seam here, the edge here of the lower lip, and then feeling the Adam's apple and feeling what the jaw is doing with the index finger. This is a technique of lip reading with touch called the Tadoma technique. And it's Tadoma because it's kind of a combination of the 2 children who first learned this technique, I believe, Tad and Oma. Oma was a girl, Tad was a boy. And it was a technique that was taught to the deaf and blinds from the 50s. And Helen Keller was one of the first people to learn the technique. Now, there's Helen Keller touching the face of Dwight Eisenhower, and from the movie, if you've seen it, that she met a lot of presidents and communicated with them. And this is how she would do it. Now, you can see the way she's doing it there is a little different from how Rick does it and how Rick was taught to do it, and possibly the way Helen was taught to do it. She put her fingers over the mouth, and I think she had her thumb down by the voice box here. I haven't seen the movie in a year or so I'll have to look back at it. But she's getting the necessary information too, which is the movement of the lips and the voice box, which turns out to be very, very important to feel the vibrations down here and how they kind of relate to the movements up here. Turns out to be really critical to be able to use this. Now, they don't have to do this with everybody. Certainly, Rick has a number of friends, including his wife, who know sign language. And Helen learned language from a sign language teacher. So when she talked with those folks, what she would do is not touch their face, which isn't as easy as actually touching their hands as they sign. And so I saw Rick do this with his wife. The wife's not blind, but she is deaf, so she knows sign language. And she would sign into Rick's hand, and then Rick would sign into her hand. That's called tactile sign if you're interested. But it did allow them, deaf, blind people, to be able to communicate with folks that knew sign language. The other thing is now there's text to Braille devices. So certainly Helen Keller knew Braille, and Rick certainly knew Braille. He had to read manuals for his circuit board construction and that sort of thing. And by towards the end of Rick retired by the time I met him, but when he was working, they would have the manuals kind of scanned on a machine that would turn the lettering into Braille for him, and he'd be able to determine what the manual said by feeling the Braille. He showed me what the device was like. He had one in his home, and he showed me how it worked. It also enables him to use the internet. This is how he, in fact, was able to communicate with me over email. The computer scans the page and changes the text lettering into the Braille patterns that are created on this device. And this is how he can use the internet, which he had done often. So how many people use this? Well, for a long time, there were many people who used this technique. There were a lot of deaf-blind people in the 50s and 60s, and you might be interested to know that a large part of the reason for that was a disease called rubella. Maybe you've heard of rubella. It is one of the vaccines. It's part of the vaccine that you get when you're young. The MMR stands for measles, mumps, and rubella. And so now there's a vaccine. So people stopped getting rubella, and there were fewer blind and deaf individuals. There still are some, but also the fact that you can give a blind deaf individual, if they're young, you can give them a cochlear implant, which we'll talk about later, to help them hear. So they'll still be blind, but they'll be able to now hear more speech. So few people now need to use this. When I wrote the book, I asked folks that were teaching the technique how many they thought remained in the country, and they said maybe 10, 15. There aren't too many alive anymore. They've kind of all passed away, the folks that had been using it before, and sadly now Rick's passed away too, so it could be even less than this. But it's still a really interesting fact that you can get speech information from touching faces. It really is, and I think it has some really interesting implications, not only for how we understand touch, but how we understand speech perception and how we understand how the sensories actually integrate. And I'll talk about that in a second. But there's fewer people that actually have to rely on this technique now. So I asked Rick, is it easier to understand some people using this technique and others? He says yes. In fact, it's easier for him to understand men than women because lower voices have more pronounced vibrations down here. But he can understand women pretty well. He has a lot of trouble understanding his daughter, and they were teaching her to sign so he could communicate with her that way. But she was just learning, and when it's hard to learn that way. So he was still doing some of this to understand his daughter. But when you have a small mouth, a small face, and very kind of a tiny little vocal cord apparatus down here, it made it very difficult for him to do it. I asked if I had a beard like this. I asked him if my beard made it more difficult. He said no, that there are people that have these huge beards that make it difficult, but it wasn't too difficult for me. But sometimes facial hair can make a difference in how easy somebody is to understand. The hand configuration, I think there's a lot of flexibility as long, again, as you're getting some sense of the lip shape and the lip movement as it relates to the vocal cord vibrations down here. And certainly Helen's able to get that with her technique. Rick was able to get that with his technique, and the way they teach it will often give it. And I talked to Rick about how he was able to master the technique, and he said it's kind of like imitation. The teacher has you take your hand when you're a kid, 11, whatever, put it on his face, and the teacher will say something, and then Rick's hand will be put on his own face, and then he'll say the same thing, and they'll try to match back and forth. And if Rick understood the concept of language before he went deaf, he knew that things in the world had words that represented those things. So that helps a lot. Helen Keller didn't, by the way. And there's a wonderful old movie that it's a kind of a quasi-fictional portrayal of how she learned what language was as a child. It's called The Miracle Worker, and it's great, great old movie if you have a chance to see it. But anyway, once you know what language is, then this technique of the imitation will work pretty well. Now, again, not a lot of people need to use this anymore, which is a fortunate thing, right? But the fact that it could be used, and I should say, you know, Helen Keller did amazingly with who she was interacting with back then. Rick understood me as well as, say, you know, an old person might understand a conversation in a noisy restaurant. So, you know, if you have grandparents and you got, you know, when you go out to dinner with them and it would be a noisy restaurant, often they might ask you to repeat yourself, maybe every few sentences or something like that. And that's what it was like with Rick. You know, I would say a couple of sentences, maybe 3, 4 sentences, and he would have no problem. Then I would say something else. He'd say that again, please, and I would do it. And so it was like that sort of thing. But for the most part, he was having less trouble understanding me than I was having trouble understanding him because of the nature of his voice, as I said before. But, you know, it was a very productive interview. And you know, I learned tons about his life and how he learned the technique and that sort of thing. So it was used, you know, it was an effective means back then. But these days, fewer people use it, but it still is a fascinating kind of window onto the mind that, you know, in terms of touch perception and in terms of, as I said, speech perception and multisensory perception. So if you take a novice, okay, or someone like Rick, and put them into a scanner. I don't think Rick was ever used, but people who are deafblind and use this technique, or people who would just learn the technique very briefly. You know, maybe after 5 minutes, they learned how to distinguish certain syllables. So imagine you go into an experiment, you're blindfolded, you have headphones on, and your hand is touching, probably you have a rubber glove on, your hand is touching somebody's face, and they're articulating. You'd be asked to see if you could distinguish some syllables, like maybe ba from va or something like that. Ga from ba. And after a while, say, yeah, I got that. Maybe 5 minutes of practice. Yep, I can make those distinctions. And then what would happen is you would be put in a scanner, or someone who had expertise would be put in a scanner to see what parts of your brain would light up as you were feeling speech for the purposes of, you know, understanding at least the syllables somebody was saying. And lo and behold, what would happen is when you touch speech, the part of your brains that light up are, yes, the touch part of your brain, of course, the little somatosensory strip here that we've been talking about. But guess what else lights up? The hearing parts of your brain and the seeing parts of your brain. So touching a person's face for the purposes of speech perception lights up the part of your brain, your auditory brain area, that is used for speech perception as we listen. And also visual brain areas. And I'll talk about the important aspect of that in just a second. But it's almost if, whether you're a novice, whether you're a novice or an expert like Rick, it's almost as if the speech brain treats felt speech as if you're hearing it, which is really, really cool. And so not only is this a cool example of touch, it's a really cool example of what we call kind of cross-modal activation, where the auditory brain, okay, which is used usually for sound, is being influenced, in this case, by touch. And also the visual brain is too. There's no sound to these subjects in this experiment. They're blindfolded. They're not getting any visual information at all. But upon touching a face for purposes of speech perception, what happens? The auditory brain kind of plays a role in helping understanding through touch, which is very, very cool. Okay, so how much can be perceived? And there you're seeing 3 folks having a conversation. Rick has had this sort of interaction with other people who are deaf and blind and has used Tadoma to understand. He had used Tadoma to understand other folks at the same time. He says it's more difficult than trying to understand one person having a 3-way conversation like this. But, you know, he can do it effectively enough that it's fun. But how much speech is perceived in this case? Well, for someone like Rick Joy, who's an experienced user. There's another user right there you can see in that picture, but someone like Rick Joy or Helen Keller, they can understand about 90% of what's being said as long as the sentences are produced in a slow kind of, a clear manner. And that's all I'm doing here. When I teach, very often, I speak a little bit slower and make sure my speech is clear. So if I just spoke to Rick Joy like I spoke to you, that would help. And if that was the case, I realized this as we were doing it, by the way, if I spoke a little bit more slowly, not too much, but a little bit more slowly and a little bit more clearly, it would help. And yes, I am sure he was getting 90% of the words I was saying at that point, which is just amazing. Again, maybe every 5-6 sentences I would have to say a word over again, but it's like interacting with your grandparents in a noisy restaurant, not much more than that, which is, yeah, so actually I say that here. It's similar to speech in the background of equally loud noise. And, you go to any bistro in Los Angeles, is probably going to be like that, and it is difficult to hear. And you often have to ask, even people who have healthy hearing will often ask their friends to repeat themselves in that context. That's how good Rick and Helen Keller were at this. So how long does it take to get that good? Well, believe it or not, some students, undergraduate students such as yourself, were willing to try this out. Were willing to learn just for purposes of understanding what it would take to get to about 90% correct. And so they'd come into a laboratory, day after day, maybe an hour each day, for weeks. And what they found is it takes about 100 hours of practice. Okay, and so your hearing, your use of touch would be almost as good as a hearing person is with heard speech after about 100 hours of training. Okay, which is pretty amazing, right? I have to give these undergraduates a ton of credit. That's a lot of practice, but with that type of practice, they can do it. But as I kind of implied a second ago, okay, this isn't just something that practiced individuals can do. As I said, if you were put into an experiment, I can tell you this for certain because we actually have done some Tadoma research in my laboratory with undergraduates who are taking intro psychology courses. When they came into the lab, we tell them what we were doing, and they'd say, I can't imagine I'd ever be able to do this. But we blindfold them, we put headphones on them, put little rubber gloves. We can't do these things anymore, by the way, and we're hoping that we'll be able to start up again after COVID. They would feel the speaker's face, and we just ask them to distinguish between syllables. And they say, oh yeah, I can tell the difference between a ba and a va. Maybe after a little bit more practice, after maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes of practice, they'd even be able to tell the difference between a ba and a pa, which is really, pretty amazing. So normal sighted and hearing folks, undergraduates, come into the lab and they can do a little of it. And in fact, what they can do is they can now use that felt speech to enhance, say, degraded auditory speech. So now what we'll do is they'll be wearing headphones so they can't hear what the person is saying. But now what we'll do is we'll allow them to hear what the person is saying, but we'll put a ton of background noise. And the background noise we use is awful. It's like this, like that. So you're hearing kind of quiet sentences being said through the headphones, but there's a lot of background noise, and it's a very difficult task. You have to kind of repeat the sentences, and people are not good at it. Maybe they get 50% of the words correct. But now if we let them hear it while they're touching the face, their percentage correct goes way up, 70, 75, 80% correct. So they are getting information from the face that's helping their understanding of what's being said enough to improve their auditory speech perception, which is really amazing. So it does enhance heard speech, and it also enhances lip-read speech. So we bring these naive subjects in again, perfectly good hearing, seeing subjects, and ask them to watch a face now and try to lip read as much as they can. And the face is silent. They're getting no sound through the headphones. They're not good at this. Most people get around 30%, 25 to 30% of the words correct. But now we allow them to watch the face as they touch it And that goes up too. It's not up to 75, 80% of the words correct. It's still a difficult task. It's more like, 50% of the words, maybe 55% of the words. But there is information in touching a face that allows heard speech to be better and seen lip read speech to be better. And the last thing I want to tell you, then I'll give you a quick polling question, is this fact. We're going to be talking about a well-known illusion that involves a mismatch between the speech that is seen and the speech that is heard. It's called the McGurk effect. Maybe some of you have seen it online. Here's an example of a similar sort of effect, but it doesn't have to do with seeing and hearing speech. It has to do with touching and hearing speech. So this is an experiment we did. Some other lab did it. The subjects came in and they were told to touch the face. They were taught a few syllables, ba, va, da, that sort of thing. And then as they touched the faces articulating the syllables, they would hear other syllables synchronized with those touched movements, but different syllables. So they would be feeling a person articulate va, okay? But what would come through the headphones would be ba, and that would be done through, kind of synchronizing the movements with a recording of a person's speech, right? And that lab found, okay, not my lab, what the other lab found was the speech that was felt influenced the speech that was heard. So if you were feeling a va, but heard through headphones ba, very often people report perceiving a va. So heard speech can be influenced by felt speech, suggesting that the integration of this new modality for speech, this new touch modality for speech, we might not be good at it right away, but when we can use it, it integrates with heard speech immediately. Also, as we've discussed, it seems to, kind of activate the auditory brain areas and the visual brain areas. So it's not something we do well, touching speech, but to the degree we can extract information from it, it seems like it's treated like regular speech in a lot of interesting ways. Okay, now let's see if it doesn't look like there's any questions, which is fine, sleepy class. That's fine. Okay, let's just do a polling question really quickly then, and we'll call it a night. And this polling question is about Tai Chi. Okay. Oh, shoot. I gave it away. All right, free question anyway. The question I labeled is Tai Chi. So, all right, here's the question. Which provides evidence that simply thinking about touch can improve your touch sensitivity? Okay, the first answer is research on Tai Chi practitioners. B is research on chai tea practitioners. Okay. C is research on prosopagnostics. And D is research on master sommeliers. Okay. Which provides evidence that simply thinking about touch can improve your touch sensitivity. And I think you know the answer because I blew it. That's probably one of the easiest questions you're going to get on the test, and I gave it to you anyway. Yeah, everyone's getting this. Okay, let me stop it here just to make sure we have a chance to talk about it. I think, let's see. Almost all of you got it right. One person or two people chose the second answer just to be funny, I think. The correct answer is Tai Chi. That is this martial art that kind of involves almost ballet, and concentrating on the fingertips, even though the fingertips don't touch anything. And that concentration on the fingertips is what allows the brain to kind of make more room for the fingertips and therefore allow the fingertips to be more sensitive to touch, which is really interesting. You're not touching anything in Tai Chi with your fingertips, but the concentration on your fingertips allows then for your fingertips to be more sensitive. Chai tea is a drink. You can get it at Starbucks. Prosopagnosia is the, we haven't talked about that yet, which might have been a little distracting. We will talk about that next class. It's people who have lost their ability to recognize faces. And then you know what master sommeliers are. I will make sure I tell you what prosopagnosics are next class so that we can ask this question the way it is right now. Okay, everybody, I will see you on Thursday. Have a good few days.